Welcome everybody. My name is Ken Coleman. I'm the director of the Center for Political Studies here at the ISR. It's a great pleasure on behalf of the faculty and staff in our center to welcome everyone here to this year's Miller-Converse lecture. Our speaker today is absolutely appropriate not only for this honor in giving the lecture, but also appropriate for this moment in contemporary American politics, and indeed in politics all over the world. My colleague Ted Brader will introduce Diane and Mutz shortly. This occasion celebrates the careers of Warren Miller and Phil Converse, two giants in the development of modern social science and in the development of this institution, ISR, here at Michigan. Warren and Phil, of course, were two of the so-called Four Horsemen who wrote The American Voter, a seminal book in behavioral political science. They were young when that book was written, but if that was all they did, they would earn the right to have a lecture named after them, and not to mention the various scholarships and fellowships and other honors around the profession named after them. But they, of course, did so much more than be part of that amazing book project. Each of them, they wrote many more books and articles and established new directions in research. Both continue to write on voting decision-making and political attitudes, making many groundbreaking advancements. Phil, with his famous 1964 article on mass publics, established, and I really mean established, several areas of research on political knowledge, on ideology, and on non-attitudes. Warren, with his famous research on representation, and is moving in comparative directions to broaden the study of voting behavior and attitudes. Both of them, in fact, worked on data from other countries and also became interested in elite attitudes. Both of them were institution builders. Warren with ICPSR and also with our own center, CPS, and Phil with broader ISR in general and the Center for Advanced Study at Stanford. They understood the value of public goods and institutions in research and in the creation of knowledge, in the training and teaching of students, in the kind of spillover effects that excellent research has on other parts of campus, on the community, and in our country. For those familiar with Phil's 1964 paper, and many of you in this room are, some of you probably assign it in your classes still, and still cite it in your work. Consider his context: post-fascist Europe, post-McCarthyism, during a period when people were claiming the end of responsible parties, the end of ideological politics, just after the 1960 presidential election, when you would be hard-pressed even today to declare one or the other major party candidate as the more left or right on many issues. Phil was saying something about the world as he saw it in that moment. So our speaker is going to talk about a very salient topic, apropos for our times. Warren and Phil were more than willing to weigh in on the big questions of the day, though they were subtle in how their social scientific findings should inform the present moment. The latter parts of that 1964 Converse paper are clearly his attempt to communicate the dangers of apathy, low knowledge in the American population, and the dangers of demagogues and falsehoods. Some things change. Like our parties today are more ideologically consistent than they were in the 1960s, early 1960s. And for good or bad, we now have something much closer to responsible political parties in the United States. But some things haven't changed, or some things come back, such as the dangers of having large portions of the public easily misled by demagoguery and falsehood. The project that Warren and Phil started, understanding better the interests of ordinary people, their attitudes, the political organizations and the ambitious people who run them, and partisanship. All of that project is still a work in progress. We continue to make headway thanks to them and the work that they began, and thanks to people like our speaker today. So Ted Brader will now introduce our speaker.
Okay, so Ken didn't want me to go on too long. I don't know why he'd be worried about that, knowing me, but so I'm going to keep this less than a half hour introduction. The primary purpose, as Ken indicated, of the Miller-Converse lecture is to hear the latest insights from leading voices in the study of elections, public opinion, and voting behavior, a field that Warren and Phil did so much to build. But it is in part a recognition that by virtue of being invited here, the lecturer has already told us a great deal about these topics and already played her own substantial role in building this field. It is therefore my privilege to introduce this year's Miller-Converse lecturer. Diane Mutz is the Samuel A. Stouffer Professor of Political Science and Communication and Director of the Institute for the Study of Citizen and Politics at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to arriving at Penn, she also taught at two Big Ten schools, conspicuous for their red uniforms, but the less said on that topic, the better, I think. Professor Mutz is indeed a leading voice in the field. Her research is focused particularly on questions of political communication and political psychology. Her research can be found in dozens of articles in leading journals and numerous award-winning books. For those less familiar with all of her work, these include such titles as Impersonal Influence, How Perceptions of Mass Collectives Affect Political Attitudes, Hearing the Other Side, Deliberative versus Participatory Democracy, and In Your Face Politics, The Consequence of Incivility, among other titles. Among her many, many articles and books that I personally have read, cited, or taught, in the classroom, perhaps one of my favorites is The Dog That Didn't Bark, the role of canines in the 2008 presidential campaign. I should mention, perhaps, that Diane is a pet lover. Among numerous honors, Professor Mutz has been elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. At an extremely young age, many years ago, received the Lifetime Career Achievement Award from the Political Communication section of the American Political Science Association, and she's been awarded a Guggenheim Fellowship, again, on top of many other honors. Her tremendous impact comes not only through published research, but through her extraordinary service to the profession. For example, she has been a mentor to many younger scholars, extending well beyond her own students. In many years, for example, at a major disciplinary conference, she has organized a dinner that gives young female scholars the chance to meet with and discuss their research with prominent researchers in their field, researchers of their choosing. Diana has also served on the advisory boards of both the Canadian and American National Election Studies. She was one of the principal investigators on the 2008 National Annenberg Election Study, and she's received the Warren Matofsky Innovator Award from APOR for co-founding time-sharing experiments for the social sciences, known to many of us as TESS. This NSF-funded infrastructure project has enabled hundreds of researchers across the social science disciplines to collect survey experimental data on nationally representative samples for free through a competitive peer-reviewed process. I've personally gotten to know Diana better this past decade during our time together serving on the American National Election Studies. First, I discovered she's a terrific storyteller. She has been on many adventures, intellectual or otherwise. I'm sure I don't know all of her stories, and I couldn't begin to share the ones I do. But I can say there's a very good chance she is the only Miller-Converse lecturer to have attended a lecture, not her own, mind you, in a gorilla suit. Just a fun fact put out there. But even more than the stories, Diana's contributions at ANS board meetings have left me further in awe of her skills as a social scientist. A staple of those meetings are presentations making recommendations on changes to the ANES questionnaire. As you can imagine, in a room with 20 plus experts in the field, academic experts debating a set of recommendations over how to use limited space on the discipline's biggest investment, monetary investment, no set of recommendations is without controversy. The most glaring exception in my time of service came when Professor Mutz recommended important shifts in how ANES measures media usage. Her presentation so thoroughly showed the limitations of earlier measures, as well as demonstrated the potential benefits of a new set of measures, that something quite magical happened. This room, full of professors, went silent. And on that note, I'll go silent too. It is my pleasure to introduce this year's Miller-Converse lecturer, Professor Diana Mutz.
Thank you, Ted, for that generous introduction. And just to let you know, I still have the gorilla suit if you want to borrow it. Comes out every couple of years. It is delightful to be here. I am truly honored to be giving this lecture, and I've been looking forward to it for months because I was told that giving the Miller-Converse lecture is a sure cure for imposter syndrome. So I'll let you know how it turns out, but I'm greatly looking forward to it for that reason alone. I'm in the midst of writing a book on the psychology of attitudes toward trade and globalization in the United States. And in the context of doing this, I've learned a great deal, both about the American public, but also about studies that my co-authors do in international relations, international political economy, and so forth. On the one hand, you might think, and I was told when I started becoming interested in studying trade attitudes, don't do it. Nobody cares what the mass public thinks about trade. There's this Washington consensus, elites are for it, and it really doesn't matter what the mass public thinks. It's not a partisan political issue. Nonetheless, I was drawn into it because I wasn't quite sure that was correct. On the one hand, if we think about trade as an issue, it's incredibly complex. Usually when elites and academics of various kinds talk about it, it's in complex economic terms, and it's highly abstract to understand an international economy of the kind we have today. On the other hand, I have found over, 5 years now of researching this issue, that this may be better understood when these opinions among the mass public in social, psychological, rather than economic terms. In fact, what I find is that many people's attitudes toward trade in the US are driven by our more colloquial understanding of what it means to trade. Like if, I have a roast beef sandwich, you have peanut butter and jelly, and I want yours, you want mine, we trade. There's still only 2 sandwiches, there aren't 3. The idea of trade is so close to that in the mass public's mind that it turns out that the same things that influence people's willingness to trade their sandwich also influence their willingness to trade with other countries. So what I've ended up doing is applying a lot of theories of intergroup and interpersonal relations to people's opinions on trade. On one hand, trade is complex, as I said, but what I find is that it acts a lot more like what we would call in the Carmines and Stimson sense an easy issue, meaning that people are responding to gut level kinds of things when they form views on trade. And we don't find a lot of difference between the more sophisticated and the less knowledgeable when it comes to what these attitudes are based on, which was to me quite surprising. Instead, what I find is that what is most important is people's reliance on what are known as folk economic beliefs, meaning that these are lay beliefs that come from our world of face-to-face interaction and get essentially extended to explain how trade works in the international world. One of the first things that is a well-known belief that children are socialized to at a very young age is the idea that impersonal transactions are inherently more dangerous. Don't talk to strangers. People you don't know, that's dangerous. These aren't face-to-face interactions. And certainly all things international strike most people as highly impersonal and in fact more risky kinds of exchanges. There's also this widespread belief that trade is zero-sum, meaning that the way the public thinks about it is that, there are X number of jobs in the world, and all we're doing is we're shuffling them around from one place to another. That essentially we're not creating more jobs or economic growth, we're simply moving things around. Who can blame the mass public for thinking that something called a deficit is a bad thing? Let's face it, most of us think of a deficit as something negative, right? The term is inherently a negative thing. And that's certainly something that President Trump capitalized on during his election, and he continues to be pretty obsessed with the idea of the balance of trade, the trade deficit, and so forth. It's widely misunderstood by the American public to mean that we're losing more jobs than we're gaining. And that is, of course, not what it means, but again, it seems like a highly understandable interpretation of what it means to have a deficit. What's more, there's an underlying assumption that markets in general must be a bad thing. That is, they must have a negative social impact of some kind. And this comes out of the idea that we judge a lot of things by the underlying motive that drives them. So, if greed is the motive for trade, then the consequences that it produces must be socially bad. People believe that markets in general are not socially beneficial things because they're driven by self-interest on the parts of both parties. Yet, obviously, trade theory presumes that greed can have beneficial consequences for both people involved in trade, both parties involved. Beyond that, again, who can really blame people for thinking that protectionism protects us? Hey, it sure sounds that way from the term, doesn't it? We call it protectionism, and in fact, there are lots of survey questions that ask if protectionism is a good thing. And again, who doesn't want to be protected in some way? Another belief, again, all of these kind of emerging from evolutionary psychology, is that things that we possess are rightfully ours. And we hear that a lot these days in terms of jobs. That is, if the jobs are here now, they must rightfully be our jobs. And so when they go elsewhere, we say that foreigners are stealing our jobs, that those are actually rightfully belonging to us in some way, even though maybe a long time ago they were someplace else. So possession equals ownership. The very first study I did of trade attitudes came out of a bet that I had with one of my IR colleagues over lunch. Ed Mansfield and I were talking. I was studying trade attitudes, and he was saying, well, we all know where trade attitudes come from, and, launched into Heckscher, Olin, and Stolper-Samuelson theories and so forth about how people's personal economic self-interest drove their preferences on trade. And I kind of smiled and said, well, yeah, in theory that's nice, but gosh, we've done all this work in political psychology showing that people have a really tough time connecting their personal economic interests to the political world. And we have, many of them done by people here in Michigan, like Don Kinder, for example. So we decided to co-author, and we decided that he would get to determine what the data were that we collected. That is, how much detail we had on their jobs, the industry in which they were employed, where they lived, all this kind of thing. We actually tape recorded a representative sample of interviews in the US so that we could later code a lot of the detail that people gave us during the interviews. And again, what we found was more consistent with the political psychology literature than that in IPE. That is, we found that people's trade attitudes were not even remotely related to their occupation or their industry of employment. Whether or not it was a line of work likely to be positively, negatively influenced by trade or not influenced by trade at all didn't seem to make a difference. We also looked at job loss in the immediate community and whether that had an impact. Did not find anything. The geographic location, heavy manufacturing area or not, and so forth. Individual job loss also didn't seem to matter. We also asked people questions about whether they thought the place that they worked was positively, negatively, or not influenced by international trade. And to see whether or not at least the subjective perception might influence their attitudes toward trade. We found that they did no better than random guessing. Most people had no clue whether or not they were hooked into the international economy in some way. And essentially, even their perceptions didn't have anything to do with their attitudes toward trade. Now, we did find that union members were more anti-trade. But when we looked at the union members' occupations and forms of employment and so forth, they were mostly employed in non-tradable lines of work. They're mostly teachers, civil service employees, and so forth. So the bulk of the union members were not actually those that we might stereotypically think of as union members, that is, those in manufacturing work and so forth. The thing that has driven more than anything else this belief that trade attitudes are self-interested is the strong relationship between educational level and support for trade. The more well-educated you are, the more supportive you are of international trade. And that, nothing I'm going to show you today contradicts that at all. The question, though, is what does education represent? Many scholars have suggested it represents skill level and the type of work you're in. But what I'm going to suggest is that it represents something very different. Education does a lot of things for people, and we know that from a lot of work that has come before. So what I'm arguing for is a different interpretation of that particular relationship. To give you a sense of what happens when you ask the American public whether or not trade affects them or not, most people say it has no effect whatsoever on their family financial situation. And that number, this was originally done in 2007, that number hasn't changed at all. People still say they are not affected by it. However, they do have impressions that are a lot more interesting of how the US as a whole is affected by trade. If it's not self-interest driving these attitudes, my first guess was that it was going to be sociotropic views. That is, what they perceive to be in the country's collective interests matter, even if it's not their own personal financial situation. And we did, in fact, find strong evidence of that, and no evidence that the perceived effects on their own family mattered to their trade attitudes at all. The question after that became, of course, where do they get these perceptions of how the country as a whole is affected by trade? They appear to get them primarily from media, did a long-term study of trade coverage across media sources in the United States, and the main conclusions are that, first of all, before 2016, there was very little of it. It was not a big source of news stories. Around 2016, though, we not only get a lot more stories, we also get more balance in coverage. That is, most of the stories going way back were about the problems trade causes, not just job loss, but other kinds of problems as well, environmental and so on and so forth. What's interesting is around 2016, there is more coverage in general and there's more balance in that coverage. Now, the really interesting thing is trying to explain why was it so negative before. I don't think it was necessarily partisan bias because people perceived both parties, elites, as being pro-trade during that period of time. It may have been the media's sense that they were there to counterbalance the Washington consensus and to push back a little on behalf of the common person. I'm not really sure how to explain that yet, but it's clear that the tone has changed post-Trump. There is a lot more coverage of both the benefits and the drawbacks of trade. So it seems that trade is now within the realm of legitimate partisan controversy and thus is given a different type of coverage by media. I've done a bunch of experiments on different types of coverage of trade. One of the things that I find repeatedly is that people's mental imagery when you talk about trade has a lot to do with the kind of attitudes that they then express. The negative consequences, job loss in particular, is a lot easier to visualize than job gains. When we give people equal numbers of both and you ask them what's in their heads, what are they visualizing, it's the negative stuff, which isn't surprising based on what we know about political psychology. The losers from trade are a lot more vivid in people's minds than the winners. But type of coverage also matters a whole lot. Individuals who were featured in these stories as case studies elicit a lot more sympathy or empathy than whole groups of people who have lost jobs in large numbers. So the one is more influential than the many. And I had to laugh. I did an image search at one point. This is just a plain Google image search for job loss. And what do you see? Again, it's the kind of mental imagery that people gave me in my studies. It's a lot of white men looking sad with pink slips, right? There is that horrible one up here about have PhD. Don't read that one, graduate students. Just ignore that, but it just came up. So yeah, you see a lot of sad white guys here. Layoffs wreck lives. It's highly sympathetic kinds of things. I then tried putting into just a random Google image search job creation or job gains, and this is what you get. You get statistics. You get graphs. And everything we know suggests these are not going to move people to the same extent that these kinds of case study approaches of people going through very, very difficult life experiences are. So overall, what I can say about media coverage is that this case study framing of job loss in particular is extremely popular. I'm sure you've all seen that kind of coverage, but ask yourself whether you've seen any case study framing of job gains. Probably not, right? It's very difficult to do a story on someone who gained a job due to export markets, even though those people obviously do exist. It's multiple links in a chain that make that far less vivid in people's minds and far less important as a part of media coverage. A lot of the coverage that we see is about individual losers, which I find have the most negative effect on trade attitudes, even when we balance it out with trade winners. The other thing that most coverage does is it does suggest to people that most manufacturing job loss in particular is due to trade and not automation. That's important because the reverse is actually true. Like 85% of it is due to automation and 15% due to trade, but the public perception is the reverse of that. And again, as I'll show you, that makes a difference in their attitudes. Did an experiment where we took an article off the front page of the New York Times of a sad white guy who lost his job at a manufacturing plant and couldn't put his kids through college and so forth. And what's interesting about this is we only changed one sentence in the story, and that was about why he lost his job. In one case, it was due to trade. In one case, we didn't say. That was our control condition. And in one case, it was due to automation. He was being replaced by a robot. Well, interestingly, the belief that jobs can come back is far greater when it's a job loss due to trade than when it's a job loss due to automation. People believe this guy could get his job back, that those jobs could come back to the country. They don't feel that way when it's a robot. They don't, envision that happening. Support for trade is not surprisingly much higher when job loss is attributed to technology rather than to trade. What was even more interesting to me, though, was, this is pointing out mainly that it's not just about job loss. Job loss is sad, and this is real for these people, but we have job loss due to things other than trade, and yet it isn't nearly as influential when people read about it. For example, the anger that people voiced when the guy's job was lost due to trade was significantly greater than the anger that they felt when the job was lost due to unstated causes or due to automation. So people don't really get very mad at robots, even though robots are stealing their jobs. It's far more personal, far more emotionally evocative when it is a person in another country in their mind. What else is driving trade? I've talked about media coverage and sociotropic perceptions of how the country as a whole is affected by it. I had a number of clues, but I was honestly kind of starting from scratch here. But one of the clues was that in the data I had, just regular cross-sectional survey data, I had measures of domestic racism, just how blacks, whites, and Hispanics feel about the other group. I found that greater prejudice was strongly predictive of anti-trade views. And this turns out to be a finding that's been replicated since then in American National Election Study data and elsewhere, but it didn't seem obvious to me why, right? I could see, well, maybe because racial attitudes are linked to xenophobia and attitudes toward foreigners, that would be the case. The second thing that was kind of surprising to me is I asked people about their trade attitudes a variety of different ways. It didn't really matter. They were highly intercorrelated. But the surprising thing was that inward foreign direct investment, which brings jobs into the country, was people's attitudes toward that were highly correlated with their attitudes toward trade, which supposedly they disliked because it took jobs out of the country, right? So in fact, they're as highly correlated as are any two indicators of trade attitudes. So what do they have in common? Well, foreign, right? They both involve some sort of interaction involvement with foreigners, whether it's a foreign company locating in the United States, providing jobs to Americans, or it's trade producing competition via imports. So again, it seemed like the operative thing here that people were reacting to, and we didn't ask them, by the way, about foreign direct investment. We used the colloquial way that is explained to people. But basically, their attitudes were the same. The other thing that was really surprising was that minorities are significantly more favorable toward international trade than are white Americans. Now, this is something that was particularly surprising to those who approach this from the economic standpoint because, of course, minorities are much more vulnerable to the negative impact that trade has because of the kinds of jobs that they hold. But overwhelmingly, at least as of the early 2000s, minorities are more supportive. And Hispanics are most supportive, African Americans after that, but basically all non-white groups were consistently more pro-trade. This was not something that Donald Trump created because it started long before Donald Trump. The other thing I did was I did a survey where I just asked people after I asked them whether they, thought trade agreements were a good idea or bad idea, why? And then these are just open-ended questions that were coded later on. And overwhelmingly, people's reasons for disliking trade are concentrated into two explanations. One is the obvious one. It's about jobs and hurting job availability in the United States. The second, though, is about in-group favoritism. It's if you're not opposed to trade, you are not a loyal American. And that, the patriotic thing to do is to be American by American and so forth. So the desirability of national in-group favoritism was mentioned very, very frequently as a reason for disliking trade. This, of course, was also part of Trump's campaign. What I find interesting about it as a social scientist is that, we spent all this time in our studies trying to allow people to show us their socially unacceptable views of various kinds that involve in-group favoritism, whether it's sexism, racism, or whatever. But people have absolutely no problem whatsoever expressing in-group favoritism toward their nation. In fact, many people did say, oh yeah, you're not a good American if you support international trade. So basically, I wanted to look further at in-group favoritism and what that meant, national in-group favoritism in particular. What is suggested to me was that Americans should be more likely to support trade with those they viewed as more or less like them. That should be particularly important to white Americans because of the tendency for the American national identity to be viewed as white, Christian, etc. And Elizabeth Tice Moore's work suggests that's the case not just among whites, but even minorities see the American identity in those terms. Basically, people trust those who are similar to themselves. When you trade a sandwich with somebody, you're not going to do it with a total stranger. You're going to do it with someone you trust. And I wanted to see whether or not this also applied in the context of trade relationships, that Americans would prefer trading more with similar other countries. The problem with this, we know that Americans are more supportive of trading with some countries than others, but every country carries all this baggage, so it's hard to say why. So anytime you have those measures, people will argue with you about, oh no, it's really because that country we have this long history of a war with, and so on and so forth. So what I did was a survey experiment on the national population, and what I did was to describe a country for people. And we had 5 different characteristics of the country. You're just seeing 3 of them here that were randomly assigned. We didn't tell them what country it was. And then we asked them whether or not they would favor America having a trade agreement with that country. So the whole idea was to see whether or not similarity of various kinds would influence people's willingness to trade with these countries. What we found is overwhelmingly it does. Every single additional characteristic that was similar boosted trade support by roughly the same amount. It didn't even matter which characteristic. What's problematic about that is that theoretically, it's the dissimilarities of preferences, endowments, technologies, and so forth that are the major reason that trade is beneficial, right? We do what we do best, they do what they do best, and so forth, and everybody gains. So the theories that suggest trade is good all rely on differences in country endowments, the differences between labor-intensive and capital-intensive countries, and so forth. But in actual practice, if you look at trade flows, it looks a lot more like this public opinion data does. That is, we trade with countries that are similar to ourselves. That is the dominant pattern, and it comes out in real trade flows, not just public opinion as well. There's a lot more trade between countries with cultural and language similarities and so forth. What's more, in this experimental data, what you see is that those similarities matter a lot more to whites. Whites are much more likely, they're the dashed lines here, stronger relationship, meaning they are affected more by these cues than are minorities. They care more about similarity to the United States than do minorities. By the way, it's also true when we just ask people what countries they think we trade with, that people who name a lot of dark-skinned countries are more anti-trade, and people who name a lot of light-skinned countries are more pro-trade. Now that causal relationship could go either way in that case, but that's the reason for the experiment here. One of the things I get asked a lot is, well, isn't this really just a sense of loyalty that people have to their, compatriots, a sense of duty or obligation? The problem with this explanation for me is that it doesn't fit other data. That is, people demonstrate little enthusiasm for helping their fellow Americans via things like social welfare, and that's true even when these people are in need due to trade-related job loss. So you would think if you really are expressing these views because you care about your in-group, your fellow Americans, that you would be willing to support things like trade adjustment assistance and so forth. But instead we see the opposite pattern. And we also see that the more strongly people identify as Americans, the more likely they are to oppose policies that help their fellow Americans. So it's hard to interpret people's negative attitudes toward trade as a sense of loyalty to the in-group, so much as negative attitudes toward out-group, that is, out-group countries. Why is it people see it in these terms? Well, my own opinion on this is that we suffer as a country from a huge lack of elite leadership on this issue. There's plenty of elite opportunism in this area. For example, we know that of the political ads aired across presidential, gubernatorial, Senate, and congressional races, out of a pool of like 5,000 of them that have been gathered in this archive, there's only one that is pro-trade. Basically, when this issue comes up, it's something that people use to electoral advantage and they bash trade. I'm going to show you two ads from the 2012 election so you can get an idea of what I mean. One of the interesting things is we ended up using these ads as stimuli in an experiment that I'll show you the results of in a bit.
Fewer Americans are working today than when President Obama took office. It doesn't have to be this way. If Obama would stand up to China. China is stealing American ideas and technology, everything from computers to fighter jets. 7 times Obama could have taken action. 7 times he said no. His policies cost us 2 million jobs. Obama had years to stand up to China. We can't afford 4 more.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approved this message. It's time to stand up to the cheaters and make sure we protect jobs for the American people.
Mitt Romney, tough on China? Romney's companies were called pioneers in shipping U.S. manufacturing jobs overseas. He invested in firms that specialized in relocating jobs to low-wage countries like China. Even today, part of Romney's fortune is invested in China. Romney's never stood up to China. All he's done is send them our jobs.
I'm Barack Obama, and I approve this message.
Okay, so as you can see, there's not a dime's worth of difference between these two candidates, and that is in fact what our panel survey shows. They perceive the Democrats and the Republicans to be identical, the candidates on trade in particular. The public has always been much less enthused about international trade than elites have been. Even though international trade was part of the Republican platform in 2012, what Trump was able to capitalize on was the fact that not just Republicans, but in general, the American public was already less supportive of trade going into the 2016 race. At this point, I decided that, I'm talking about basic psychological things like in-group favoritism. I really need to look at another country that has a different level of support for trade to get a sense of whether this is US specific and just basic human psychology or whether something different is going on. And I chose Canada in part because I can speak French and English and not a lot else. But I knew that Canada was a lot more pro-trade, a lot more dependent upon trade as an economy. I also knew that Canadian elites have promoted trade. There has been elite leadership of opinion in this area in Canada. It's also true that they have a stronger social welfare safety net should you lose your job due to trade. The other thing that made it particularly interesting in light of how racial attitudes are related to trade is that Canada in 1988 passed the Multiculturalism Act, which officially identifies their country as promoting multiculturalism and diversity as a national value. Obviously, in the US, multiculturalism is still far more controversial. So I started out doing the same thing I did in the US. I asked people in open-ended questions, why they like trade, if they liked it. So their reasons for favoring trade are almost exactly the same as Americans. That is, overwhelmingly, they would cite, first of all, the availability of goods. So again, think of the sandwich analogy. They have things we want, we have things they want, that's why we trade. Very much the most popular reason of anything specific that people said about reasons for favoring trade. And I have to say, relative to the reasons for opposing trade, these are all over the map. There are many more categories. But Canadians sound a lot like the US. Their reasons for opposing trade are also similar and concentrated on job loss in particular and on in-group favoritism. I heard over and over again, be Canadian, buy Canadian, and so on and so forth. So you might as well just plug and chug. It's the very same things Americans were saying. They also had similar types of misperceptions of trade. They misunderstood trade deficits in the same way I suggested earlier. The most surprising one to economists that I've talked about this with is I gave them a question that asked them about the effects of international trade on consumer goods in their country. And there are only three options. You could choose it increases the cost of consumer goods, it decreases the cost of consumer goods, or it has no effect on the cost of consumer goods. Basically, people did tiny bit better than chance, but under 50% of Americans are aware that trade lowers the cost of consumer goods that they buy. Now, I thought that was just, Americans were so ignorant and so forth. It's exactly the same in Canada. They also do not understand the relationship between trade and inexpensive consumer goods. And it was also the case that manufacturing job loss was viewed as primarily a result of trade in Canada as well. There's another difference, though, that turns out to be extremely important in understanding how Canadians responded differently, and that is Canadians are higher in what we call social dominance orientation, and SDO, as it's commonly called, is a measure of how much you believe in hierarchy over equality, and it's not about particular groups or any content-specific thing. It's just whether some groups have a right to dominate other groups because they're better than those other groups. So what you see here is the US is a lot higher on social dominance than is Canada. That turns out to be important to the story that I'm telling. Americans also, based on world values surveys and others, Americans love competition. They believe in the fairness of unequal outcomes and that competition, separates the wheat from the chaff and gives the deserving what they deserve at the expense of others. So basically, Americans are a more competitive bunch than any other industrialized country. What's interesting when we talk about trade as a competition is that when economists talk about winners and losers due to trade, they're talking about the distributional consequences of trade. They're talking about the fact that people in certain lines of work are likely to be hurt and people in other lines of work are likely to benefit. That's what they mean by winners and losers. But the way the American public talks about winners and losers due to trade is as if this were the Olympics. And we're competing with other countries in international trade, and the most common thing, we're going to be the losers and they're the winners and so forth. But it's a very different framing of winners and losers. What I found is this is pretty common. Even this is a book by a couple of well-known journalists called The Betrayal of the American Dream. That very much makes this zero-sum argument. Basically, it's the CEO of a global hedge fund made this clear to a Reuters journalist when he told her that his firm's investment committee often discusses the question of who wins and who loses in today's economy. He said one of his colleagues argued recently that the hollowing out of the American middle class didn't really matter. His point, the CEO explained, was that if the transformation of the world economy lifts 4 people in China and India out of poverty and into the middle class, and meanwhile means 1 American drops out of the middle class, that's not such a bad deal, okay? So, of course, these journalists don't agree with that view, as they go on to say the only problem is that no one told working Americans they were going to forfeit their future so that people in China, India, Brazil, and other developing countries could become part of a global middle class. Okay, so you get the idea here that it's us versus them, the way this zero-sum thing is being set up. It's a really good question, right? If 1 American loses a job but 4 other people gain them, is that a good deal? And this became the basis for a survey experiment that I did in both the US and in Canada. And I asked people, not just about jobs, but about a whole bunch of different dimensions of how trade, in their view, influences the US and influences our trading partner countries. What was fascinating to me is that 50% of the American public said trade hurt US jobs and helped trading partner jobs. That it was essentially a form of foreign aid that we were engaged in here. Very few people took the standard economist view that it's a win-win kind of situation. Some were completely isolationist and so forth, but the reason these don't add to 100 is that some people didn't know, particularly when it came to trading partner countries, what they thought. Here's the same exact question asked in Canada. Okay? Instead, what we see when we combine those 2 questions is that only 27% of Canadians see trade in zero-sum terms. Far more of them see it in terms of the standard economic view, that is, that we can both win due to trade. Given this difference, it means that Canadians are half as likely as Americans are to see trade in these zero-sum, highly competitive terms. And what I find is this makes a big difference. If you look just at straightforward survey models and so forth, what you find is that social dominance only matters in the United States. This may be in part due to the impact of prejudice against racial outgroups and foreigners, or from just this competitive need to dominate other countries. The other thing that I find really fascinating is nationalism, a scale asking, essentially, do you think your country is wonderful and everyone else should be like you? Nationalism reduces support for trade in the US. That is, the more you think your country's wonderful, the more you hate trade. In Canada, it's just the opposite. That is, those who think Canada's the best thing since sliced bread are very pro-trade, and they're more pro-immigration as well, which is also the opposite of the relationship that we're used to seeing. Why is that? Well, I think it has a lot to do with Canada trying to define its national identity in terms of diversity and openness. If you don't like Canada, or if you don't like diversity and openness, you don't like the Canadian government, because they have officially made the country stand for that. So it makes some sense to me that nationalism and thinking Canada's wonderful goes hand in hand with being pro-trade and pro-immigration in that context. The American definition is obviously very different. The final thing I did was to do a survey experiment following up this survey to look at whether or not, if we experimentally control who wins and loses in a given situation, do Americans and Canadians essentially respond the same way? Are they no different? It's just they have different assumptions that they bring to the table when they evaluate trade. Or do they respond differently even when we give them the same basic facts about a trade agreement? I did an experiment that was, it looks big here, but basically there are 3 main conditions. In one case, we tell people the trading partner gains X number of jobs and the home country loses X number of jobs. In another case, it's the reverse. The trading partner loses and the home country gains, and we hold the total number of jobs constant. In the third condition, it's the win-win. It's the classic economist view that, in fact, everybody wins from this arrangement. And in this case, obviously, more jobs are gained because both are gaining and there is no loss. Those are the three basic conditions, but we also altered how much is gained or lost. So 7 different possible combinations of gain or loss across 3 different general scenarios of who gains and who loses. And the point of this was to see whether or not, hey, at some point, or if enough jobs are gained by people in the world due to this, is it worth it, even if, let's say, one American loses a job? Very simple experimental treatment. This is the whole thing right here. Depending upon whether you are in the US or Canada, we're told your country is considering a trade policy that would have the following effects. And then people were just asked, did they favor the US embracing that agreement or not, or oppose it? I looked for 2 forms of in-group favoritism here. The first one I call compatriotism, which is the obvious just favoring your in-group, your national in-group, because they're citizens of the same country. So to the extent that you're more supportive, the more your country gains, that's evidence of compatriotism. So it's basically these first 2 conditions. And what you see here is pretty interesting. Americans are more supportive when the home country gains and the trading partner loses jobs than are Canadians. The Canadians are the reverse when it comes to when they lose and the trading partner gains. They're more willing to support it when it produces jobs for their trading partners, even when it means a loss of jobs within their own country. So this is obviously a strong interaction here between country and these experimental scenarios that were, administered identically in the 2 places. We had open-ended questions at the end of this that I find really interesting about asking people what they were thinking about as they decided about this trade agreement. There was plenty of evidence of people valuing lives equally and overcoming this kind of sense of tribalism. All people should be treated equal. People shouldn't be favored just because of where they live. So obviously that idea is entering their minds. Also, some people saying it could help the rest of the world a lot more than it can help us. So we do see these kinds of comments, however, those are not the majority. Overwhelmingly, what we see is people making statements about American lives being more valuable or Canadian lives being more valuable than trading partner lives, or livelihoods, I should say. My favorite one is this one in the middle here, Americans greater than foreigners all. I thought that was pretty concise. But basically, you get a strong sense here that people feel we are more deserving of these jobs than are people in our trading partner countries. We need to take care of our own first. We should care about our own people, not another country's people, and so forth. This is the predominant kind of thing that people say when we ask them what they were thinking about, very much about in-group favoritism. This is a front page article from the New York Times that caught my attention in part because I'm from Indiana, and this is about a company in Indiana that was closing. And basically this woman here, her name is Shannon Mulcahy, this is your classic case study frame. She is losing her job. It's going to Mexico. But what's really interesting, and I think representative of the more nuanced kinds of stories that we're seeing about people hurt by trade, is that in this story, it's actually 3 whole interior pages in the New York Times, really long. Basically, she is given the option of going to Mexico to train her replacement. And she decides, I've never been to Mexico. Sure, I'll go, and I'll get paid more, and given that I'm losing my job, I could use the money. So some of her coworkers criticize her for that. But she does go to Mexico, she trains her replacement, and she kind of changes. And the story really follows that. For example, Ricardo's the guy she's training. He pecks at a calculator. 16, he announced. Rex Nord could pay 16 Ricardos for the cost of 1 Shannon. Okay, so they're doing the exact kind of calculus that was in the journalist book. 16 Ricardos could be paid for 1 Shannon. And she starts to like this guy too. And then she finds out what his standard of living is like. And it's not nearly as good as hers in the US. And she actually comes to think, as the article ends, she says, well, I'm not happy about losing my job, but I guess it's his turn to be blessed. So there's this kind of what I want to say, lack of anger that comes out in the story after she goes and sees what that situation is. Well, one of the things that's fascinating to me is that in Canada, we can actually, identify at what level of gain to the trading partner countries do people essentially say, yeah, the loss of one Canadian job is okay, it's worth it, I'll support trade. And you can see that by where these two lines cross when we take into account jobs gained and lost. And basically, one Canadian job is worth about 10 trading partner jobs in the minds of Canadians. The really interesting thing about this, though, is when you look at Americans, they never cross. And I'll be honest, I pre-tested this experiment on M-Turk, and they did cross. M-Turkers look like Canadians when you do the same experiment. But in these representative samples, there is no amount of gain in trading partner countries that makes Americans okay with the loss of even one American job. Now, what that suggests is that this is a highly symbolic attitude. And that is, in fact, what I find across the board. People favor and oppose trade for reasons that have little to do with complex calculations about jobs or incomes or risk of job loss and so forth. Moving on, I want to talk about a second form of in-group favoritism, which I find even more interesting, and that is this notion of intergroup competition. I've mentioned that Americans are a lot more competitive than Canadians. In general, they like competition more. What I mean here is a tendency to favor the national in-group relative to the out-group so that they maximize their relative advantage over the other country. So in this case, they're following a strategy of maximizing the difference between what they get and what the other countries get. And this is something Jim Sidanius has called Vladimirs Choice. And it's based on this Eastern European folk tale about a guy named Vladimir. Vladimir is a peasant, he's lived a good life. God comes to him at the end of his life and says, I will give you one wish, anything you want, you name it. There's one catch though. Whatever I give you, I'm giving to your neighbor, Ivan, twice over. So Vladimir thinks about it and he says, fine, take out one of my eyes. Okay, so obviously he doesn't end up better off, but he is relatively a lot better off than Ivan is, who's now completely blind. Well, it's the same kind of logic that we see in the intergroup competition comparison here. We know that being competitive makes you more susceptible to this. And what's interesting is in the US, when we compare the conditions where the in-country gains are identical in the two conditions, all that's different is whether the trading partner loses or the trading partner also gains from this agreement. There's absolutely no difference between Americans' level of support for it. So, you'd look at this and you say, well, basically Americans don't care about how other countries are affected by trade. What's interesting is that in Canada they do. In Canada, there's significantly greater support for the win-win policy as opposed to the one where the in-country wins the same amount, but the trading partner loses jobs. So more orientation toward the greater collective gain from the policy. Again, when you put those two things together for Canada and the US, again, what you see is when it's a gain-gain, Canadians like trade the most because everybody wins. But the more competitive Americans prefer when the trading partner loses and the US gains. They're more supportive under conditions where it increases their relative dominance over the other country. Yeah, I know, it doesn't make it sound very nice, does it? Well, basically, what we see is that the biggest difference comes in attitudes when it comes to whether or not Americans actually think of trade in terms of a competition and whether or not we want to increase our relative advantage versus simply whether we gain from that experience or not. So if you look at these are all 27 conditions shown simultaneously here for the 3 different scenarios. This intergroup competition thing turns out to tell us a lot about group differences in the US. For example, if you look at Republicans and Democrats, Republicans overwhelmingly like trade when the US wins and the trading partner loses. Again, far more emphasis on an agreement where we win, they lose, we dominate more. Democrats, on the other hand, are more supportive of the win-win type of trade agreement in the US. We see the same difference with men and women. Men are more likely to favor the competitive scenario where we win more than they do. Women, on the other hand, are more supportive of trade when everybody wins, when it's more of a cooperative, everybody wins type of arrangement. Before I finish, I want to talk a little bit about, this is my excuse for why I'm not done with this book yet. Things keep happening, and they're really interesting. So we had rising opposition to trade between 2012 and 2016, and I can show a zillion measures that show that. But what's fascinating is what's happened since then. We've had a continuation since then of the same pattern of basically the same percentage of people think trade has affected them positively and negatively at the individual level. No big difference there at all. But we've also had the racialization of trade going on at the same time. And what I mean by that is that we know racial attitudes are linked to trade. And I had a feeling that all this anti-trade rhetoric we saw, like in those ads, did more than just encourage opposition to trade. So did this experiment, it was a Latin Square experimental design, where we used those two ads I showed you earlier, Obama and Romney's trade bashing ads, or China bashing ads, I guess you could call them. And basically people participated in one experiment, and then an hour later we asked them if they could sort these students for admission to a college. Who do they think should get in? And we rotate the characteristics of the students so they're exactly equally qualified and so forth. All that we change is what they look like and whether they're Asians, Chinese nationals, or Asian Americans. And what we find is that those exposed to the trade bashing ads were systematically less supportive of the Asian American students, even though their qualifications were identical. So it's not only that attitudes toward foreigners are influencing people's attitudes toward trade, it's also that their attitudes toward trade are influencing their attitudes, I think I got that backwards, but you got the idea, toward foreigners. So regardless of what kind of anti-China campaign ad you were exposed to, again, I don't think people were all aware that they were being influenced this way, but they found Chinese nationals and Asian Americans both less deserving, having seen that ad an hour before. Part of the reason I did that study was because people told me that, oh no, it's not going to influence the election. I actually have some evidence it did play a big role in the election, but I think it's also true that it affects society as a whole, that we find it socially acceptable to bash foreigners. This is another experiment we did. Job loss due to trade made people think Asians were less trustworthy, Chinese in particular in this case. We also gave people a list of negative Chinese stereotypes. We didn't ask them if they supported them because we pretty much knew they wouldn't say they did, but we asked them whether these would be unacceptable things to say, like at a cocktail party. And if you've seen the trade bashing ads, you're more likely to say it's acceptable to say these kinds of things. Even, again, if we had a job loss due to technology, it didn't create that same kind of effect at all. Final thing I want to point out is, although some of this is kind of depressing, the other thing we've done is look at how malleable people's attitudes toward trade are. And what we find is that, you know, the economic arguments really don't work very well. We've tried to educate people about the cost of consumer goods due to trade. We don't get any change in their trade attitudes. However, when we go for trust, interpersonal trust, we find that we can move people's attitudes toward trade. And I want to give you an example of that. Here's an example of one of our failed ones where we take the cost of consumer goods and show them how massively more expensive they are if they're made overseas. If they're made in the US than overseas, people don't care. It had no influence whatsoever. We've done other ones of this variety. On the other hand, approaches that emphasize human similarity, we found very big and consistent effects. I'm going to show you an example of one of these.
I think the Chinese people and their work ethic is the key to the future. They have emulated in what we did with our Industrial Revolution, and they're taking it to another level. And we want to be there with them.
What would surprise you about America and Chinese citizens is that we're more alike than we're different, because both cultures are based on family values.
When a Chinese company purchases a company in the U.S., I think the thought is they're going to come here, they're They're going to buy the company, take the brands, move all the manufacturing to China, and not do anything to help the U.S. market economy. We've found that to be the exact opposite.
We were concerned listening to different things on TV about the Chinese, how they were trying to buy up everything, but it hasn't happened. We're able to hire people on, and we hadn't done that in many years. It's like a family atmosphere. When TDC bought into it, I had my daughter, she was in college, which she's graduated, so that helped me put her through college, which I was concerned about. I also have a grandson. He's awesome, but you know how teenagers are, very expensive. So thanks to Jeff, I'm still able to afford him.
My English name is Jeff Chi. I got this name when I was in university. If you work in this company, you try to love this company, try to make this company like your family. Beginning of this company, I make that word. Company is your family.
Well, the price of lumber had got down so low that it was hard to make it, and so we closed the business down. But Jimmy came along and offered me a job. I was his first employee. I didn't know what to expect from a Chinese boss man. Never worked around any Chinese people. So it was quite an experience, and it was a great experience too. I mean, he put a great number of people back to work. Well, Jimmy, he counts us all family. When we have our meetings, that's one of the first things he'll say is my family.
Chinese companies have invested more than $46 billion since 2000, and that alone has created over 80,000 jobs in the United States.
We all have a dream, right? And whether it's an American dream or a China dream. When you wake up as a child and your parents are telling you you can be anything you want to be, that's universal, right? It doesn't matter where you're from. And I think if we're working together and we're talking about what our goals are, what is our dream, what do we want to be, then we have a chance to getting there together.
Okay, as you can see, they mentioned the word family. I don't know how many zillion times I lost count. But the emphasis here is on how we're all the same, right? We found that in experiments that this ad had a really big effect on people's attitudes, not just toward foreign direct investment in the United States from Chinese companies, which is really what it was designed to do. It also improved their attitudes toward trade with China. The Chinese people became more trustworthy, et cetera, et cetera. What's fascinating about this is that one of my graduate students from China, originally brought this to my attention, and there are a bunch of videos like this. This isn't the only one, and they're all very professional. And part of what he told me was that it says it's made by the Communist Party of China here at the end. Okay, one of the things we did was to create a new version of this ad where instead of it being in Chinese at the end, we put made by the Communist Party of China in big black letters. And I told him it wouldn't be effective anymore once we did that, that people would react to it. But actually, even when we readily identified it as made by the Communist Party of China, people still experienced changes in the direction that was intended, more pro-trade, more pro-China, etc. We found the same thing with many other similar kinds of ads that have been produced by the CCP. These effects, as I said, were sustained even when it was identified by source. I think part of the reason for that may be that it's Americans talking, right? There are very few Chinese actually talking in that video. They're mostly hearing from other Americans. And so the fact that it was made by China and by the Communist Party didn't seem to have an influence on people. Finally, where are we now? What's happened since Trump was elected? Well, I showed you this slide before that 50% of Americans saw trade as zero sum. Now that number's down to 27%. Basically, there's been a change in people's realization that trade may have some benefits for the US as well as doing potential harm to workers. So this has changed quite a bit. What's more, the really bizarre thing is that not just this particular question, but NAFTA and everything else, since Trump was elected, support has gone way, way up for international trade. Now that makes zero sense based on theories of presidential opinion leadership and so forth, But look, these are panelists. These are the same people at 3 different points in time. It's not the non-Trump voters that have lifted the overall level of support for trade. It's actually the Trump voters. Now that, I'm still working on explaining that, but I think it has a lot to do with the fact that their trust in government went through the roof when Trump was elected. And they do believe that he's somehow going to produce trade agreements that are more like the we win, they lose variety for them. Finally, I just want to close by telling you, this is an overview of my book at this point. If there are other topics here that you'd like me to talk about, including nationalism and so on and so forth, or the role of gender in trade attitudes, I'm happy to do it. But at this point, let me open it up for questions. Walter.
So I'll be telegraphic because you'll get it. So the last thing you just showed about the change over time raised my small question about whether the surveys you showed at the beginning were static cross-sections, or if you have any way to have the impact of changes in trade. For example, it could be the soybean farmers learned the importance of trade once they couldn't sell any more soybeans because of the trade embargo. The other thing I want to say has to do with I heard your argument about we don't have leadership in America in favor of trade, and I thought that can't be right. I'll just name a few acronyms going backwards in time: TPP, NAFTA, cap and trade, the Marshall Plan. I mean, they're very big policies pursued by elites in
I didn't mean
past.
it for policy.
And so they also had rhetoric to support those policies at opposition. And the third thing, which is kind of related to that, is back in was it the 30s, we had the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which were in the other direction. I wonder if you've looked at if there's survey data from those days that you can use to assess how that relates to this topic.
Thanks. These are panel data, so we are following the same people over time. We've got them pre and post recession, for example, and the ones you're looking at here, as well as the ones in the beginning, are panel data. Only the experiments, those aren't panelists, those are ones that we only talked to at one point in time. What I'm saying is a little more nuanced. That is, candidates don't campaign pro-trade. After they're elected, heck yeah, they're pro-trade. And in fact, that's why we have had all these trade agreements like NAFTA and so forth in the past. The problem is, it's not something that they are actively communicating to the mass public during elections. In fact, they're running the other way. I mean, look at Hillary Clinton disavowing any support for NAFTA and so on and so forth. She was not pro-trade in the sense that she was exercising opinion leadership to try to persuade the American public that this was a good idea. Instead, candidates and policymakers these days, even those who are unelected, they all seem to be afraid of this issue because there's this well-known big gap between where political elites are, which is very pro-trade in general, and where the mass public is. That doesn't mean that the leaders aren't actually pro-trade, but I'm talking about in terms of their public statements. At election time, they all run trade-bashing ads. Obama only championed the TPP when he was no longer running for re-election at the end of his second term. So he did actually go out and try to promote it, but it was because he was no longer vulnerable election-wise. So that's part of what I mean by this, that there are places where people actually say and campaign on being pro-globalization and using globalization as a means of creating jobs, improving the economy, and so forth. U.S., we see a dip in long-term trend data that the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs has. Every presidential election year, there's a dip in trade attitudes. And it's largely attributed to the negative opinion leadership on trade that we usually get at election time. Again, Trump's was bigger than most, but it's not the case that people feel they can voice this view without vulnerability. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. And one question I had in terms of another possible way for Americans to be so isolationist or thinking that we don't need partners has to do also perhaps with the sense of abundance in America and the range of natural resources, the range of geographical climates, the idea that perhaps we don't need to trade with others because we have tropics, we have Mediterranean, we have everything.
Yeah.
You can't say the same for Canada. At least popular perceptions of it are a wintry wasteland. So, where are they going to grow citrus? I mean, they need partners because of their natural resource base and the deficits thereof. So, is that playing any role in your analysis?
I think that perception is true, and Americans certainly voice this idea that we're better off if we do everything here at home. In reality, no, I don't think that would be the case. And in reality, even Americans need things from other countries and so forth. One of the articles I ran across during the content analysis was this very approving article in the New York Times about a family in the Northwest building an entirely American-made home. You know, everything from the bathroom counters and the marble, everything, they were going to make it out of American-made materials. And they ran into some trouble. Apparently we don't make a lot of nails. So it's not the case that we have everything here that we could possibly need, in part because globalization has meant that we specialize in certain things and other countries specialize in certain things. And I do think, you know, the impact of Trump's tariffs on various sectors like farmers, like those, Harley Davidson was massively in support of trade in my home, in support of Trump in my home state. But then when they started not being able to get steel to build motorcycles, it wasn't so great anymore. So yeah, I think part of this is that people are getting an education in an unfortunate way, but they are getting an education in what trade means. And I don't think, though, that necessarily the economic argument is necessarily going to be what convinces the mass public at large. There are certain things that seem to resonate with people. Just during the last couple of years, the data that I've collected, one of the things I've noticed that people brought up a lot, and honestly I hadn't asked a lot about it, was they would say things like, we need to make sure we don't, you know, basically make the rest of the world irate. We need to keep our friends close and our enemies closer. They would use that as a reason that they supported trade with China, for example, that they were afraid that if, you know, we can make enemies of Canada, for heaven's sakes. We've managed to do even that. Canadian attitudes toward America are at the lowest they've ever been right now. They are truly, you know, pissed off at us. So to some extent, that argument seems to be partly because of Trump's extreme rhetoric, maybe, is people are starting to worry about that, about harming international relations in that sense. But yeah, I mean, obviously it's been an unusual couple of years here. We haven't had a president who has gone to the kinds of extremes that he has in claiming that, you know, it's very confusing because of course he says trade is bad, but on the other he said, oh well, but you know, we'll make a different kind of trade deal. It will be one where we win and they lose, sort of thing. So yeah, Nick.
So I think I've seen this a couple of times and now I see the whole book and it's just amazing. I really learned a lot from the talk, thanks. Have you looked at England? I mean, we have this interesting case where their politics might be a lot like Canada's in some ways. Those of us who study race think the racial argument probably has a lot to do with Brexit. And so have you looked at data from Brexit?
I do have some data on support for Brexit and so forth that I have looked at in parallel. And the big difference between attitudes toward Brexit and what's going on in the US is that there is driven much more by immigration views. Immigration is obviously, everybody already knows immigration is tied to racial attitudes and so forth. So opposition to Brexit, support for Brexit is driven far more by immigration than by trade. That's not the case in the US. And in fact, immigration, based on my panel data, did not help Trump at all in 2016 because the American public is becoming increasingly positive about immigration during this period continuously. It really hasn't stopped. And I think what's, I guess, most troubling to me is that partly because Trump won, a lot of people think that Americans have become more anti-immigration. They're just assuming that must be the way the wind is blowing, given that he was elected president. But we don't really find any evidence of that. And basically, in terms of where people saw Trump on immigration, they saw him as way too extreme. And so it did not help him, even among Republicans. So to me, that suggests we do have a bit of a different dynamic. They want trade in Europe. Britain wants the trade part, they just don't want the immigration part.
Oh, you don't have a chapter on impact of trade attitudes on trade policy. And so I'm wondering...
On voting, I do have.
I see that. So I'm wondering, from your talk, it sounds like the modal voter is opposed to trade in the
Not
U.S.
now, but that was true
Previously,
before 2016.
okay.
Yeah.
And our political elites haven't been leaders in articulating pro-trade messages. But the policy movement since 1944 or before has been uniformly towards liberalization with a couple ups and downs in
Until
the 80s.
The last 2 years.
And then the past couple of
Yeah,
years.
the last 2 years,
exactly.
lots of things have gone the opposite direction.
And there are interesting episodes where anti-trade actors try to capitalize on it, like with Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot, but really nobody has systematically tried to use this as an issue. Why do you think that is? And maybe my premise is wrong. Maybe it isn't that the sort of median voter is opposed to trade in the U.S., but...
No, before 2016, that was true. As I said, there's been change. People have started to get the idea that, oh, maybe we do need that after all. I think the difference is that those anti-trade candidates you're talking about, they never won. So having Trump in office has meant a huge number of, changes in policy that have been very much in the opposite direction of this long-term trend that you're talking about. I think in the past, those policies were very much done by elites without a huge amount of public support being necessary, or they didn't go out and try to sell it to the public necessarily. Sure, people in certain lines of work and so forth, certain industries might know about it because they cared about it, but for the mass public, it just wasn't a big issue. I think if one of those people had won in the past, we would have had the same thing that we have now. But ironically, I think Trump is having the opposite effect of what he might want. That is, he's convincing people that this is actually a problematic view. Something that sounded so simple as, oh, let's just put up walls and do everything here. We don't need anybody else. And actually, this gets back to your question. Canada's smaller. Canada is more trade dependent than the U.S., even though we are trade dependent to some extent as well. The funniest time I ever talked about trade was in Abu Dhabi. And they're all like looking at me like, why would people dislike trade? We don't get it. I mean, all we have is sand. we have to trade. We don't have food. We don't have, and it went on and on. But the sheer idea that people would view this as a potentially negative thing was just not there. We see the same thing, by the way, when we set up, another thing that's controversial is when different states compete with one another for companies. We're hearing about that with Amazon and so on and so forth. You might think that, and in fact some economists think of that in the same terms, but the public has no problem with states robbing one another of jobs. They see there's no reaction to that to the same extent that there is toward between country movement of the same variety.
So bundling on the trade seems to have been sort of a negative issue. The interesting question then seems sort of how latent and how long-term do we think that was there? Because one of the implications, and it might be wrong, is that Trump's victory was in part due to tapping into this latent dislike of trade, right? And if that is indeed true, how come the other people that attempted to tap it did such a miserable job at it, right? And why did it work now becomes this interesting sort of secondary piece.
I'm sorry, how did something, I forget, I missed the part of it.
So,
there.
so how did the people that attempted to tap into this previously, right,
Uh-huh.
the Buchanans and whatever, do such a miserable job at it? And
They were
why did it
third-party
work now?
candidates.
What?
They were third-party candidates.
Well, Buchanan ran on the Republican side on at moments and was viewed as much of an outsider, I would think, as Trump was at the beginning of the last election.
But he was the Republican nominee. I mean,
Yeah.
that makes a big difference. That's a platform. People are going to listen to you. And one of the things that's fascinating, if you look at the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs, going way back, as long as they've collected data, I think they started in the early 80s, the public, there's always been this big gap between elites and the public. The size, yes, changes over time, but it's been there a long time. And in fact, Larry Bartels likes to cite trade as the issue that's the opposite of his usual stuff on how, well-educated, high-income people have greater influence than less educated, lower-income people. Actually, on trade, he argues that it's the big exception. What happened with mass opinion on trade was that we had a crossover in who the party of free trade was. And that did not happen in 2016. We can't blame Donald Trump. It happened earlier, around 2000. And all of a sudden, perhaps for racial reasons, I couldn't tell you exactly why, but long before Romney, and in 2012, the Republican platform still said free trade. But early 2000s, there was a crossover. Democrats were much more pro-trade than were Republicans. Now, I remember growing up thinking, oh no, pro-trade is a Republican position, not a Democratic position. So that's a change that he capitalized on quite well in the primaries in particular. Because Republicans were already there. But the Republican elites who were running as mainstream Republicans weren't. And in fact, I think right now, many of the members of Congress who are more or less towing the anti-trade line along with Trump don't actually feel that way because they were pro-free trade before, not that long ago. So again, I think that is the view people are afraid to challenge at the moment.
Okay, I want to thank our speaker, Diana Mutz, and thank everybody here for the great questions.
Thank you very much.